In 2005, I was elected to the European Parliament, and for the next 14 years, I'd go almost weekly to one of the two Parliament buildings you see behind you, either the Parliament building in Strasbourg or the European Parliament building in Brussels. And one of the things that strikes you as you walk into the European Parliament is how different it is to the British Parliament. In Westminster, if you look at the TV coverage, what you tend to see is you see the government of the day, consisting of the majority party, being held to account by the opposition party, which literally sits on the opposing benches. It's very much an adversarial political system, with the opposition holding the government of the day to account. And for millions of viewers worldwide, it's interesting jousting, competition, rivalry, and humour. In the European Parliament, it's quite different. What you have is pan-European political groups who don't sit opposing each other, but actually sit next to each other in a hemicycle. Also, what complicates politics in the European Parliament is that no pan-European political group has a majority. And what that means, in order to get a majority, coalitions have to be built between different political groups. Sometimes those coalitions change even within one particular piece of legislation on an issue-by-issue basis. So, for example, the group I led in the European Parliament, the European Conservatives and Reformists, quite often we would find common cause with, say, the Green Group on issues such as animal welfare, but when we were voting on issues such as international trade, we'd find common cause or build a coalition, quite often with Christian Democrats, with an Eastern European and Central European Social Democrats, and Northern European Liberals. What that showed as well was that even the political groups themselves were coalitions in their own right. Now, in 2010, we found ourselves in an unusual, if not unprecedented, situation in the United Kingdom, when after that general election that year, no party had an overall majority. And what we saw were days of negotiations between the three main parties, and in the end, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrat Party agreed to a coalition. But during those days, what was interesting was the fact that many of my colleagues in the United Kingdom contacted me and other members of the European Parliament to ask for advice on coalitions. And interestingly enough, I gave a number of talks on coalitions, and a few years later, I found myself being invited to an African country to give a talk to African political parties on how to build coalitions. But what I'm going to do today is not talk about how to build coalitions, is to take a step back and have a look at coalitions. What can we learn from, for example, entry-level maths at school, and also look at some of the ideas around coalitions, and also recognise that coalitions are probably more prevalent than you think. And then we're going to look at some of the issues that people see as divisive and find whether we can actually build a coalition around some of these issues. So let's start with a definition. And if you look at the definition from the Encyclopaedia Britannica, it is described as a group of actors that coordinate their behaviour in a limited and temporary fashion to achieve a common goal. The key phrases there are coordination, limited and temporary, but also a common goal. Let's apply this to other fields. So perhaps you remember your entry school maths when you did these things called sets or Venn diagrams, and you had overlapping circles. Here's a very simple example. It's obviously simplified because there are other choices, but think about what children are asked for at school, what they want for their afters or their pudding for school dinners. Some will go for ice cream and jelly, others will go for ice cream and flake. But there will be a commonality between those pupils who both want ice cream. Of course, there will be other commonalities. So, for example, there might be other variations. There might be people who want jelly and flake and no ice cream. But in this particular case, what we are looking for is overlaps in what people's desire, and to look for some commonality between people who might seem to differ on other choices. Let's apply that to the 2010 coalition. And in simple ways, you can look at the 2010 coalition as a Venn diagram or the overlap. You see Conservative policies on one side, you see Liberal Democrat policies on the other side, and then you look for those policies that the two parties might have in common. Now, what's interesting about this overlap is not static, and these things can change. It's rather dynamic. So if you think about the fact that before the 2010 election, in the Liberal Democrat manifesto, they were calling for a referendum on the alternative vote system, but the Conservatives did not have this in their manifesto. As part of the negotiations for the coalition, the Conservatives agreed to hold a referendum on the alternative vote system. So what you see is a policy that was unique to one party now having an overlap between the two parties, and they agreed on that in order to make the coalition work. Now, that was a very simple coalition, and I'm sure if you look cover elections around the world, you will see that there are quite often more complex coalitions. You might have a three-party coalition. This is quite often common in places like Germany and some other countries. You may have a four-party coalition. You may have more parties in a coalition, very common in places like Italy and also places like Israel, for example, where you have to put together a number of different parties in order to have sufficient number of seats to build a majority. Now, it's not only political parties that can be viewed as coalitions. Quite often what you can also do is build a coalition of voters. And quite often politicians and and sometimes single issue causes try to build a coalition of voters. Now, in Washington, D.C., there's a Republican strategist called Grover Norquist, who holds a weekly meeting of what he calls the Leave Us Alone Coalition. And what he does is bring together people who might disagree on a number of other issues, for example, social conservatives, libertarians, and people who feel strongly about no gun control. And they might disagree on some of those single issues, but what they agree on overall is that they want the government to do less. They want the government to leave them alone. So Grover Norquist calls this the Leave Us Alone Coalition. Now, he defines the Leave Us Alone Coalition in contrast to what he calls the Take-Ins Coalition. And he defines the Take-Ins Coalition are different groups of people who want the government either to regulate an area, or they want taxpayers' money to be given to them by the government. And he gives the examples here of the three groups: the welfare recipients, the various contractors and employees of the government, and companies that ask for protection from the government so they don't have to compete against foreign imports. Grover describes this as the Take-Ins Coalition in contrast to his very own Leave Us Alone Coalition. Now, what you can see here is clearly looking at parties and voters as coalitions. You can actually see the Conservative Party, in this case, as a coalition in its own right. There are many people who have many different views within the party, generally on the centre-right. And what the Conservative Party, or any party, does is bring together people roughly agreeing in a coalition. So here's a very simplified version of the Conservative Party, and I'm sure you can add many more circles. Think about the social conservatives, the libertarians, people who feel strongly on a single issue, such as lower taxes. Now, they may disagree on lots of other things, but they agree that the Conservative Party for them is the best way of achieving what they believe in. Similarly, you can do the same thing for other political parties in the United Kingdom, but also other political parties worldwide. So political parties themselves can be seen as coalitions. Now, one of the things I want to look at here is that's all very well, but what about more complex coalitions? How do you get a number of people from different areas or different points of view? Sometimes that might seem to be in opposition. How do you bring them together to agree on something? And here we see a more complex coalition. And what I want you to focus on, or what I want us to focus on, is that tiny kind of triangle as the intersection of different views. Now, one of the most famous examples of different coalitions recently in the United Kingdom were the coalitions that formed around the 2016 referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union. And let's look at those coalitions in turn. If you look at the Leave coalition, here are a list of different items that people felt strongly about, or the factor that caused them to vote for Leave. And you might say that some of these issues actually contradict with each other. For example, the Global Britain people would disagree with those people that others called Little Englanders. Or some saw the EU as far too socialist a project, whereas others saw the EU as far too liberal or free market a project. Now, they would ordinarily agree But all these groups came together to agree on a simple message. And the message that united them was take back control. And let's contrast that with the Remain coalition, as it was called, the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign. And once again, you see some examples, not a comprehensive list, of issues that people used to decide when they voted at the ballot box. And they decided to vote for Britain to remain in the EU. And once again, some of those issues tend to contradict each other. Say, for example, those people who believe that Europe was enough and Europe is the world, what others call little Europeans, would disagree with those who wanted Europe to be a global player and saw the EU as a stepping stone to being a global player. Once again, you see different groups within that coalition disagreeing with each other, but they all came together to vote Remain. But what was interesting was that the chief executive of the Britain Strong in Europe campaign said afterwards, Will Straw, he said how the Remain campaign failed was because they couldn't find a single message that was emotionally resonant to unite all those people together. So in the end, the Remain campaign focused on the dangers of leaving. What that allowed was a Leave campaign to say, you're focusing on all the negative things while we present a positive vision. And they accused the Remain campaign of basically being project failed. Now let's look at those coalitions side by side. And you can see they are divided on the issues of Leave and Remain. And you can see that there are issues within each coalition where they disagree with each other on other issues. But what's interesting about this is that quite often people look back at the 2016 referendum and say it was divisive. But if you look at each coalition, what was remarkable was how they managed to unite people with very different views under one of those campaigns, either for Leave or for Remain. So that offers us some hope. Even where people might wildly disagree on a number of issues, they can be brought together in coalitions if you can identify that issue that brings them together. So are there issues, for example, today that are seen to be divisive and difficult? And maybe can we find a way to bring them together on agreeing on one issue? So let's look at the issue of the environment and the range of different views you see on the environment, ranging from people who say climate change isn't happening, right through to people who say, well, maybe it's happening, but there's not much we can do about it, or it's happening, so therefore we have to adapt, or I'm not sure, all the way through to people who say, Greta Thunberg is right, let's agree with her, we have to deal with this now, the world's going to end in 10 years or whatever if we don't deal with it. Given the range of those views, is there an issue within that we can bring together all the people who on the surface might seem to disagree? Well, maybe. How about if we focus on the issue of less waste and pollution? Here is an issue that most people would agree on. And if you think about it, in order to achieve that, you will probably be looking for policies that go along the road to making us have a cleaner environment, less pollution, same things like electric and hydrogen-powered vehicles, more solar power, more alternative energy. Now, of course, not everyone, or those spectrum of views, will agree, and some may not join the coalition. You can imagine, for example, the Extinction Rebellion crowd and those who are purists and say you have to admit that climate change is happening and it's going to happen and we have to sort this out in a few years. They may not join that coalition. Likewise, at the other end, those people who take great pride in not separating out their household waste and throwing everything in the same bin rather than separating out into recyclables, maybe those people might not be brought into that coalition, or maybe they will. But here we see an issue that's worth trying to bring people together. Let's get rid of waste. Let's reduce waste. Let us also reduce pollution because we all want a cleaner environment in which to live. So let's look at the different views that you might see in that coalition. Right through, once again, at Spectrum, lots and lots of different beliefs on the issue of climate change, but you might get them all to agree on the need to reduce pollution, the need to reduce waste. So, in effect, what we are saying for a coalition is that you don't have to agree on everything. What you have to find is one issue or a number of issues around which people who might disagree on other issues come together in agreement. And to end it all, you think about this phrase. If we can agree to disagree on what we disagree on, then maybe we can agree to agree on what we agree on. And maybe in an age of separation, we may be able to build some coalitions.